with us. I'm curious as we begin class, just to get you thinking along the lines of what we're going to be talking about. Have you ever been I'm sure you have been disappointed at some point with other people, particularly I think with leaders who maybe didn't measure up or live up to what you hoped they would do or be, and you just disappointed in them. But I think a step beyond that, that is the point of disillusionment. I think it's increasingly important for all of us to understand that even our leaders are people with clay feet. There are times that there are times we sin, okay? There are times we sin. But it's one thing to sin and be disappointed that someone sins. It's another thing for someone to sin and they don't seem to care about their sin. And that creates, I think, disillusionment. Or again, you're able to work through in the disappointment. You're able to work through kind of saying, they're human, they're vulnerable to the same kind of things. Just because he's a preacher, an elder, or whatever it is, doesn't mean that they don't have the same struggles I do. I can work through that. But if that person responds to their sin with indifference, if they don't seem penitent, that leads oftentimes to disillusionment. We're going to talk about that as we talk about our bad guys for today, Hophni and Phineas. So parenting is a hard job for any of us, but being in ministry brings unique challenges to parenting. Now, I wasn't sure if we were going to have any of our children in here today. In some ways, I'm glad that they're not. So I can speak freely. Okay? But what do you think would be the advantages and disadvantages of trying to parent when your job is in full-time ministry? What do you think would be the advantages and disadvantages of that?
I think an advantage may be the exposure.
What kind of exposure?
I would say some of the things that you have to do, the constant influence in your life of those, just seeing that over and over every day,
Okay.
or seeing others being ministered to, and also being exposed to, real world, real life situations of people's lives and decisions and the results of those decisions. And maybe seeing that.
You know what? That's one of the two things I've got down. So I think you're exactly right. The constant exposure to ministry opportunities, both good and bad, and that's an advantage to see that fuller picture of maybe what humans are capable of, good and bad. Well, we'll go with the advantages since we started out there. But what other advantage can you think of that a child might have?
Well, I would say that some might see it as a disadvantage, but I feel like it's really an advantage in the long run is that they see that you're flawed, even though you're trying to minister, which is an advantage because they will see the grace in that, I guess. But
okay, so being able to see flaws in the in this case, a dad will help them recognize that everybody needs grace. Okay. Any other advantages you can think of? People watching you can be an advantage.
I was going to say that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I haven't got to the disadvantage. Okay, just hang on. Okay,
Accountability.
you hear what she said? people expect you, they're watching you, they're expecting you, so it kind of is an advantage in that way. So let's talk about the disadvantages. Now, Michael, make your comment.
I think that you have the people that feel like you have to live up to a higher standard, that will be scrutinized more so for even the slightest thing that you do wrong.
Yeah. That's why, and some of you will even remember this. I guess most of you don't, but my very first sermon here as full-time preacher on May 31st, 1998, I talked about boundaries and not to expect my children to be any different from anybody else's children. And I've had to deal with that a few times when people come and say, well, your kids are, I'll say, wait a minute. Mine are no different than yours. I'll hold them accountable, I assure you that. But don't expect more of them than you expect from somebody else's kids, okay? So that is both an advantage and a disadvantage. But the other is also true, that being exposed, is an advantage. But I think it's also a disadvantage, because what I have seen at times is people, young people, kids, they become casual about it. It becomes somewhat of an inherited thing. They don't own it. Hard for them to own it because it's something that they've always known and they just kind of was handed to them. So I think it can be a disadvantage or an advantage. I think, and I'd like to hear, Laurie, your comment about this, but I think that our children, liked being preachers' kids generally, but not everyone does. Not everyone does. And what comments I've heard from children of preachers over the years, it's largely because dad is away, ministering to everybody else, but not to his own family, and the pressures of expectations are the reasons they've hated being ministers' kids. So it depends on the children, depends on how the father handles it. What do you think?
I think everything you said, I agree with. I think we try to be open and honest with our kids about ministry, and they certainly know we're far from perfect. And I think there have been times along the way they felt like, well, everybody, especially related to sports. I mean, we're a big sports family, but at the same time, sports wasn't number one. And there were times when there were conflicts, and we had to make hard decisions. And I think even like when we brought Jacob in, he said, well, you only do that because you're the minister's family. No, it's not accurate. It's just who we are. I think one of the benefits of ministry, it was kind of implied in what Angela says, your friend group, your circle of people that you're around generally are really good, solid people. We've asked our kids several times, if you didn't feel like you could come to us with an issue, who would you go to? And they've been able to name really good people that they would go to.
So I offered this question because it sets the context for what we're going to talk about with Hophni and Phineas. Okay? These were preachers' kids who grew up to be priests. And so they're the bad guys that we're studying today. So what all went into them becoming bad guys? And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So let's turn to 1 Samuel 2. Somebody read verses 12 through 17 for us, please.
Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a three-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." If the person said to him, "Let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." The sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt.
Yeah, I hope you paid close attention to the description here. Eli was the high priest at Shiloh. His sons, Hophni and Phineas, were to continue to carry out the priestly duties. How are they described, and how would you react to spiritual leaders who behave like this? So, catch some of the phrases or words used to describe them. What do you see? Scoundrels. Some translations say sons of Belial, which again communicates this idea that, what is a scoundrel? Wicked, base. They are as fleshly as they follow their own desires above everything else. And it doesn't matter what those desires are. That's what they're going to follow. Okay? What else do you see then? How else do you see them described?
No regard for the Lord.
No. Wait a minute. Say that again.
No regard for the Lord.
These were the priests. These were the guys who were supposed to help people know the Lord. And yet they had no regard for the Lord. What else? What'd they do with the meat?
They were selfish, kept it.
We'll take only the portions that we want. Okay? So they were gluttonous and greedy. And if you didn't want to give them what they asked for, what would they do? What?
Take it again.
By
Force.
They were bullying people. Okay? You don't want to give it to, we'll take it anyway. And so the only choice you have in this matter is whether you'll give it freely or whether we will take it by force. What else do you see? How does this end?
Treating the Lord's offering with contempt.
So how, the first part of that verse.
Sin of the young man was very great in the Lord's sight.
God didn't miss this. I mean, he didn't overlook this. This is not something that he was blind to. God saw what was going on. And it was considered a great sin in God's sight. All right. So the second part of this question is, so if you were aware of spiritual leaders who were behaving like this, how would that affect you?
I think a lot of people would turn away from the church
Why?
because they would feel like they were being hypocrites, I guess, and, which in church, that nobody's perfect, but people on the outside that aren't believers, they feel like they hold us to a higher standard, which we should be, but nobody's perfect.
So a lot of people would be turned off because they'd see the hypocrisy? How else would you react?
Well, it'd be, that's how they act there. I don't want any part of it.
Because it's not real. Okay, we're going to come back to that. I think, and I'll just go ahead and throw it up there. I think that a struggle for a lot of people today, even for Christians, is getting the mark.
Getting them.
Okay. I think most people today immerse themselves in whatever they consider is the realest thing in their life. Keep that in mind as we're going through this. I think the reason some people, as you've already mentioned, avoid church is because of what they've seen from leaders. Okay? Let me just go ahead and tease you some more. If I saw Hophni and Phineas, I would think that what they stood for or what they supposedly believed in was not real. Right? And I don't want something that's not real. I'm only interested in what I think is the realest thing in life. And if these leaders are not interested, have no real respect for what they're doing, how do you expect me to have respect for that? Right? God's got a problem here, doesn't he? Let's see how he deals with it. Somebody read verses 22 through 25 of 1 Samuel 2.
Now Eli was very old, but he was aware of what his sons were doing to the people of Israel. He knew, for instance, that his sons were seducing the young women who assisted at the entrance of the tabernacle. Eli said to them, I have been hearing reports from all the people about the wicked things you are doing. Why do you keep sinning? You must stop, my sons. The reports I hear among the Lord's people are not good. If someone sins against another person, God can mediate for the guilty party. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede? But Eli's sons wouldn't listen to their father, for the Lord was already planning to put them to death.
What additional information do we learn about Hophni and Phineas, and how do you think their behavior would affect the Israelite community? What do we learn about them?
They've gotten kind of arrogant too. I'll do whatever I want to.
Not many limits are there, are no limits, maybe is the right way to say it. What had they even started doing? Yep. You don't see any kind of respect or regard for anything that's holy or moral or right or wrong, do you? So they were using their position and their power to do whatever they wanted to, and they didn't care who it offended. And they apparently weren't even very good at hiding it if they even tried. How did Eli even know anything about this?
People talk.
People were talking. It doesn't appear that he had firsthand knowledge of this, but even people were talking and, share with Eli, here's what's going on with your sons. That disregard for the sacred has a way of spreading. In the Bible, it's often referred to as yeast. You'll remember that Jesus said once to his disciples, don't take on the yeast of the Pharisees. And those real bright disciples said, he's upset because we didn't bring you bread. That wasn't what he was concerned about. What was Jesus talking about?
What they were doing.
All right, he was talking about the influence that kind of unholy life has on other people. And so I'll make this comment and go right to it. So sometimes we hear people say, I'm just hurting myself. You never just hurt yourself, okay? Your attitudes, your actions, your those come out in all kinds of ways and have an impact in all kinds of ways. You never just influence you're never just hurting yourself. it finds its way out. Go ahead, Matt.
Or just also the way that it kind of grows within you. You know, you talk about, you know, people, when something's hot or not, you know, you don't want to touch it. But as you warm up to things, all of a sudden you're in a spot that you never would have just gone to, you know, initially, because it was just, that's just wrong. But something that grows in you like that, you end up in a place and you don't know how you get there.
Yeah.
And that's gonna, I mean, and, you know, later on, you know, they don't even listen to instruction from their dad. And it's too late, you know, and it says because God's will has already put them to death, and that's scary to me. I mean, it's just like, how far do you get where you're so hard that God lets you be hardened and just lets you stay there?
Yeah.
Where you don't listen to the Holy Spirit, or whatever. And that's another, I've heard this before too, sorry, I'm rambling, but I've heard it said before where, you know, how long would it take for you to realize that you don't have the Holy Spirit in your life?
And they didn't. For them to be at the point where God said, there's no more hope for them. And it's kind of like the world before the flood. Things can't be turned around. Things couldn't be turned around because they had gotten to the point where they had a contempt for things of God. And so here's where it concerns me. It wasn't real. It was clear that holy things, that the things of God were not real to Hophni and Phineas. It was a platform through which they exploited people. Okay? That attitude can easily spread to everyone where you're thinking, if leaders don't think it's real, why should I think it's real? And so I started investing my life in other things that seem more real than all the pretense that seems to be coming out of the leadership of Hophni and Phineas. And so I think sometimes, and Laurie alluded to this a moment ago when she was talking about Jacob's impression, the idea that some have that Christianity is all pretense. You all just playing a game. It's not real. That's what some people think. You know, you're just trying to impress people. That's the impression that people have. But Hophni and Phineas weren't even trying to impress people. Now they had gotten so far, so hardened, they weren't even. So no one takes things seriously when they think it's all pretense. And so from this, God said, I've just got to cut them off. This will not only end the life of Hophni and Phineas, this will end their priestly line. Which is pretty significant. That God said, I can't even let your descendants go on because there's corruption there. Pretty serious stuff. Brad, you want to say something?
Yeah, well, this whole story is, man, it really sticks out, you know, what's real. That's a big deal. With that said, this is the kind of story that people always balk at. You know, you talk about God's love and being unconditional, and people are always questioning, well, how can a God of love just say, it is my will that they die? And so I think that's a good, I'm just looking for answers that help people understand that.
So you're saying that we are seeing a side of the character of God that some people would rather not talk about.
Right, yes,
Yeah.
yes. And a lot of people have trouble reconciling how a God of love does this. And so this, I don't know, it doesn't make him less real. That probably makes him somebody they don't want to know, or, you know what I'm saying? So I for one, you know, people talk about God's love being conditional versus unconditional. And so some people say, no, his love is very conditional. Look at this. Here's an instance. His love is conditional. Whereas I would deep inside say that this is, God probably sees this as the most loving thing he could do.
Why?
But
Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, it's hurting so many. It's hurting. I mean, it's hurting his whole kingdom to let this go on. But
What you're hitting on, Brad, is again something that is probably a little unique to Western thought and to Americans in particular. And that is this very individualistic view of God and of his kingdom. I only think about it in terms of how, if I was in the place of Hophni and Phineas, forget all those people who are being affected by Hophni and Phineas. What about poor Hophni and Phineas? Well, that's not how God sees things. He sees everyone and he sees all circumstances. And so he's reacting to what is the most loving thing that could be done in this situation. And what God determined the most loving thing to do was, for the sake of all these other people, I have to put in the lives of Hophni and Phineas because they are beyond repentance. Okay? So we learn something about the character of God in this.
This story is really about discipline and lack of discipline.
Okay, well, let's just jump. You're jumping to the next question. So let's start again. Somebody read verse 28 and then verse 13 of chapter 3.
28 or 29?
I said 28, but I meant 29. You're supposed to read my
You
mind.
should know what you think.
Yes.
Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel?
Okay, 3:13.
For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them.
All right, these are two verses that where God is speaking. And God pointed the finger of blame at Eli for the conduct of his sons. What did God say offended him, and what do you think Eli failed to do? Let's start with the first part. What did God say offended him?
Eli honored his sons.
How do you do that?
People do it all the time. They're the best, greatest, we don't let anything bad happen.
Okay. So we kind of make idols of our children? Yeah. It's easy to do. Plead guilty in some cases. What does it mean? What did he mean by you honored your sons above me? How do you do that?
When the situation came up and maybe this is obviously not the first time, probably this is a pattern of behavior, right? So he didn't deal with it for their benefit what he thought was their benefit instead of what was best for God.
All right.
So he chose them over him.
All right. And we're going to get to maybe the motivations and the heart behind that in just a minute, but you're right. He chose what would be more pleasing to his sons than would be pleasing to God.
And maybe more pleasing for him.
And
his
maybe more
conflict
pleasing
is
for
not
him.
pleasing, right? So
Least conflict, he thought, in the moment. What do you think Eli failed to do?
It really sounds like he made an example, set a good example. It says, you have made yourselves fat from the best parts of all the offerings in the people of Israel. Sounds like maybe he was taking it.
Okay, and we're going to talk about that later in question number 6, about how he had actually participated in this. What did he not do? What does God say directly he did not do? He did not discipline them. He did not rebuke them for their abuse of power and sin. Now, what's interesting is you read this in the whole passage, and you can come away and you say, well, no, wait a minute, he did confront them once. He chided them, it seems, a little bit for what they were doing, but there was no real consequence to it. All right. Now, what does that equate to? That equates to a lot of threats, but no teeth to the threats.
They blew them off. Yeah.
It was easy to blow him off because he never followed through. You know, and you probably heard parents who will say, now, if you do that one more time, I'm going to, well, on second time, third time, 10th time, parents haven't done anything. So what's a child learning from that?
Disrespect.
They don't mean it. There's going to be disrespect. Yeah. So this makes me think, as Matt, you mentioned, that this is a pattern of his fatherhood. His exhortations had no teeth to them. There was never any real discipline. There was never any real consequences. So his sons went on unchecked. So why would a parent do that? Why would a parent do that?
It's hard.
It's hard. Well, if I do that, then what's the fear?
They may not like me.
They may not like me. Guess what? You're right. They won't in the moment. But they'll love you for it years from now. It takes years and years from now. Okay, just for those of you who maybe aren't quite where I'm getting to, where kids are coming back and saying, thank you, I'm figuring out some things why you did what you did. You know?
Sometimes you're just so tired too.
Fatigue. Oh, do we have to do this again? I thought we just did this last night. Why do I have to do this again? Fatigue. What other reasons?
In the case of Eli, he had other business going on and was likely oblivious to what his kids were doing.
He's too consumed, too busy, too consumed by other things to discipline his sons.
I
Yeah.
see that in a lot of places, like David was a terrible father.
David, why? Too busy. Yeah. Maybe this,
You need to be intentional.
say it again.
It proves the point that you need to be intentional.
It proves the point. I want us to come back to that in the last question, question 7, about the practical applications for us, about the importance of being intentional. Maybe Eli didn't want his sons to be bitter about being priests, so he didn't expect a whole lot of it. I'm going to let them slide because I want them to like being priests. You know, I don't want them to be bitter about being priests. And as you know, the very basic one that Matt pointed out, I just want my kids to like me. And so I keep telling young parents, you cannot allow that to be your motivation. Because if you do, you're going to compromise and you're going to regret doing that. They can like you later. But as you're parenting them growing up, there are going to be times they don't like you. Guess what? You're not going to like them too much at times either. Okay? Because we're talking about people who are flawed. And as parents, our job is to help shape and scrub off some of those edges that need to be molded and disciplined.
You know, it's interesting.
So I didn't do it.
What's interesting is when you typically see that, they end up not liking each other anyways.
Yeah. Permissiveness will eventually lead to a sort of resentment of, you never gave me anything. You never helped me become a person. You never did the hard work. It becomes a resentment later on. You know, this is the thing I love to tell young couples who are getting married about their marriage, about young parents, about parenting, is if you will do the hard work early, you will be blessed and blessed and blessed and blessed and blessed. If you do not do the hard work early and you let it slide and you go with what seems to be easy, you will pay for it and pay for it and pay for it and pay for it and pay for it. That's reality. So you can either do the hard work intentionally early, or you can wish you had done that later. Okay? Reality. And Eli didn't. He clearly didn't. And that's why his sons were so corrupt. So Eli's sons were grown men with their own families. What do you think God wanted Eli to do with his sons that he failed to do? What should he have done? I mean, we read where he kind of chided them. Sons, what you're doing is not good. God doesn't want you doing this. Okay, so that wasn't apparently enough. What did God want him to do?
Relieve them from their duties.
All right. You said it in such a nice way. I wrote down he wanted Eli to fire them. You can't be in this job anymore, son. You've done it. What would that have communicated? What's the realest thing? Sons, you're not the realest thing in my life. God's the realest thing in my life. You're done. How do you think that would have impacted Hophni and Phineas? Initially, they would have been mad. They would have probably pouted. They would have probably thrown a tantrum. But distancing themselves a few days later, and they're not in that job, and they don't have all these perks, and they don't have all this power, what's going to begin to happen? Yeah, you're right. It's never guaranteed.
It's their choice still, right?
It's still their choice. But it gives them an opportunity to make a different choice than they've been making. Otherwise, they never have a motivation for doing anything different. Okay? So it would have given them a chance to turn around. 1 Samuel 4, 17 and 18. Somebody read that, please.
The man who brought the news replied, Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also your two sons, Hophni and Phineas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken and he died, for he was an old man, he was heavy. He had led Israel for 40 years.
Just as God promised, he brought an end to the legacy of Eli and his sons. How do we know that Eli was at least a complicit participant in the evil of his sons? Why did he die?
He didn't do anything to stop them.
All right. You're talking about God's punishment to him. He didn't do anything to stop them.
When he realized that the ark had been taken, the only two read about his sons are didn't affect him. The news that they were dead for years.
So
It mentions that he was heavy,
Yeah.
which is not something, I mean, God doesn't go around pointing out if people are thin and heavy. So there's a reason they included that, and that maybe he would partake of all their extras all those years. It might not have happened that way.
exactly. That's included not as a some kind of
Jab or,
indictment
yeah.
against heaviness. It's a statement about why he was heavy. And the implication is pretty clear that he had enjoyed the choice portions that his sons had exploited from the people. And so can you imagine the mixed message that Eli was sending to his sons? Sons, what you're doing is wrong. but now that you've got them, do you mind sharing some with me? Can you imagine how confusing that'd be? And so it's not just that we need to be intentional in parenting, is we need to make sure we're sending a clear, singular message to our children, because it's, if you're condemning something, but at the same time enjoying the benefit of it, a child's going to go whatever it is that he or she wants to go with.
My dad always said, do as I say, not as I do.
So what was the impact of that?
Watch what people do, because that's what you really believe.
Yeah. Yeah. And they had watched Dad enjoy the portions of meat, and so that's what they kept doing. Dad, you really don't mean that. You're not going to do anything to us. You're enjoying this with us.
It's really okay.
It's okay.
Yeah, try, so you learn a lot about that, how you are with things when you're trying to teach your kids how to drive. We're doing that with Kinley right now, and of course Brady now gets to chime in, but it's like, hey Dad, the speed limit's 50. You're taking too long to slow down, those kind of things. And I'm not a horrible driver, I don't mean like that. I've slowed down my old age, but it's just, it comes out.
Yeah. But they watch, they observe. They are looking for, what is the realest thing? So if you say, God is the realest thing, God is number one in my life, we need to focus on God. But they see something very different than that. What are they going to believe? They're going to believe what they see. Okay? They're going to believe what they see. Which is very convicting and very, as a parent, it can sure get in the way of your own enjoyment sometimes. Because it forces you to do a lot of kind of self-evaluation and self-examination too. Okay? So,
Bill, there's another thing that's kind of countercultural, at least in my world, is these men, including Eli, rose to their position based on birthright, not merit. And I think that is a strike against people. Now, we see a lot of that in our society. Obviously, it happens. But I think when something is not by merit, and you don't have that wholeheartedness for that position, you're going to be prone to abuse it, take advantage of it.
yeah, because you really don't want to be there anyway. So you're going to get the perks out of it for what it's worth. So that brings us really a good transition to question number 7, which is, what are some practical lessons for us about parenting, about spiritual leadership, and how unchecked evil can spread and affect everyone? So what's the practical lessons you see here?
You all have a responsibility to bring them together. And your children don't have that responsibility to teach them. That goes back, what are you really imparting? Because the responsibility ultimately comes back to you. I think we want the people that were just beating to death. The kids they're terrible. Every generation says that. And I thought, well, they aren't your fault because you raised them. So I just think there's responsibilities to parents. If your kids don't get it, some of that is on you, not on them.
Yeah. Again, it's always a choice to a kid, but in many cases, parents aren't accepting the responsibility of what they have actually imparted. Not what they said, what they've actually imparted through their actions. Yeah.
I'm reminded of the Bonhoeffer quote, "One act of obedience is better than 100 sermons." And I think your kids see that. If they see you be obedient, if they see you be real in your life, obviously they're going to follow suit. And if you say things but do another, obviously we're all going to fail, but if it's a consistent thing in your life, God's not going to be real. Your faith isn't real, so their faith is probably going to be hard to catch hold in them. But if you're obedient and then you demand obedience, I think your children learn to follow and be obedient to God by doing that, for you. I think it's a big thing. being in school, I used to work for a principal a lot of years ago that said the nut doesn't fall far from the tree all the time, you know, when a kid would be acting up, and then, you know, then you would discipline them, and here would come the parent, you know, to defend them, and, you know, try to get them off, and that's, you just sort of feel sorry for the child at that point, because like it's never going to take hold.
Yeah, and I think it's important at this point, and it's already been alluded to, but I want to make it real crystal clear. Sometimes when we have these kinds of conversations like we're having this morning, a lot of parents go away feeling completely defeated because we know how inadequate we are. I'm not talking this morning about being perfect parents, because none of us are, and none of us will be. I'm not setting the standard of perfection. What I'm saying is, what's the realest thing in your life? Because your children will figure that out pretty quickly. It's not about perfection, it's about pursuit. Okay?
I think along those same lines is as Christians, I mean, we strive to be transparent. I mean, who we are here needs to be who we are away from here. And, you know, like your dad, you talk about your dad said, don't do as I say, don't do as I do, whatever, but, you know, people are looking at us, and we have to tighten our game up, you know, because, you know, the harvest is plenty, but the workers are few, right? So we're put in positions to be Christ-like, and we need to accept that responsibility. I need to accept that responsibility. That you know, I may be the only Jesus that anyone sees, so am I being Christ-like? Am I glorifying God to my kids, to my coworkers, to community, or wherever I am? It's a big responsibility. It's not just being a preacher. And I felt good coaching with you back in the day. You're a third base coach as a preacher. So, you know, I felt pretty good that our parents were being nice to me because they didn't want to, you know, you're the preacher.
You know, you had to bring that up, Maury. This illustrates what I'm talking about. There was a game, and I hope, Maury, that you don't even remember this, but I do. It was a Sunday afternoon. It was a makeup game because it was a Sunday afternoon, and we tried to avoid it, but it didn't conflict with assembly, so we played it. And I was coaching, and I got upset by a call by the umpire, and I went storming to him. And at some point after my childish display, he said, I will throw you out of the game. And I, you know, probably my bottom lip probably stuck out, and I turned around and walked away or something like that. Had a couple of moments of perspective, refreshed, and after the inning was over, I went back to him again. He was ready to battle again, and I warned you. Wait a minute, I'm just coming to apologize. Okay. He said, and so I apologized to him. I told him I was, that was out of line. He said, you get caught up in these games. I said, don't diminish it. I was wrong to behave that way. So as it's probably not a good thing for your third base coach, preacher, to get thrown out of a game on Sunday afternoon. And so we're not talking about perfection. We're talking about pursuit. And that's what seemed to be absent. There was contempt for God and the things of God. Okay? Other practical lessons.
The way I would say that is that what was missing in their lives was a relationship with God. When Eli had a relationship with God, and as parents, we're not supposed to teach our children about the rules of God. We're supposed to show them a relationship with God.
And they didn't have it, did they? They did not have it.
Well, kind of what Sarah mentioned earlier, and just with being intentional. I'm sorry, but and what you just said about pursuits, I think that kind of goes hand in hand. I'm sorry, I don't remember who said intentional, but just pursuing their kids' relationship, like you said, and pursuing your own relationship with God, and also helping them pursue their own relationship with God, and then pursuing them as your own kids and teaching them. I think, like you said, the realest thing also stands out in what you're chasing after. And, people see, I've heard it said too, you'll find out really what's important to you when you ask your kids what's important to you.
Yeah.
And then,
They may not be able to articulate it in their younger years, but they see it and they know it. Last comment, Maury.
I don't remember that part on your third base deal, but I do remember.
Let's erase that.
But I do remember praying before the game, after the game, with about our parents and their kids at church. Those are good times, and thankfully we had some bumps in the road, but we had a lot of fun times and fun memories. But I'm hoping that, from the experience of those times, people knew who we were, who we represented, and what was real in our life. I think that's their life. I mean, whether it's on the field or off the field, that's what we want to do.
Yeah.
Do that. This day and time, it'd be hard for me. I know I'm over my quota here, but it's hard. Our world has changed so much from when our kids were young. Back when our kids were young, our kids actually respected us for the most part. But this world today it's tougher for kids because our culture has just changed. So we have to be a little bit harder on our kids. Tough love now, come to church, come to Bible class, whatever, than maybe it was 20 years ago. It was a little bit easier. They just did it because they're supposed to. They didn't ask why. Now they're like, why do I go to church? Why do I do this? So we have to be more intentional and be a little bit, may not be your friend right now, but when you get older, you'll respect them for it.
Respect. Seems like somebody preached about that recently. Thank you all, and may your children see you pursuing a relationship with God.